So, hi, this is Carlton Doe. And when Scott and I were um, defining how this presentation will go, we kind of broke it up into really basically two pieces. I would handle all the replication features that were in 14.10, along with the FC8 enhancements, and Scott would handle everything else. Well, Scott, being the overachiever that he is, he just went through and gave my entire presentation. So mine is going to be really short because I won't bore you to death with all the information that he gave you. I will spend, again, just a brief highlight on FC8, though the in-depth FC8, the replay is available on the IIUG TechTalk YouTube channel, as well as in the Informix community pages. As always, if you have questions, put it into the chat. Scott will be monitoring that and replying to them, or I will as part of the conversation. So briefly, an FYI, if you were not aware of this, historically, getting access to the CSDK and JDBC packages, the drivers, has been, let's just say, problematic. Nobody knew where they were unless you were an IBMer and could hold your tongue in just the right place. Then all of a sudden the website would magically appear and you could then give it to a customer and they might or might not be able to download what they were looking for. All of the available CSDK and JDBC packages have now been migrated to the Informix Trials and Download site. This is where you would download your Developer Edition, your Innovator C Edition installer, your time-limited versions of different products. In total, about 250 packages were moved over, and they cover both 4.10 and 4.50. And as I said, it should be complete and comprehensive, because some work went into making sure that everything was available to you. Now, then some of the metadata might be a little messed up. I know there were a couple of people who were commenting that the JDBC drivers had multi-language as opposed to Java in their description. And, I apologize for that. There's 500 and some odd packages out there now. And while I went through and looked at each one, I didn't get down to the nitty-gritty of every single field on every single package. So I apologize if it's not precisely identified, but described. But the important stuff is there. The version number is correct. The platform is correct. And like I said, all available CSDK and JDBC packages are there. So the other thing is, copy and use this specific URL. There are some other URLs that are floating around that have in the middle of it an extra parameter. And that parameter, if you try and access the Trials and Download site, will lead to tears because it just doesn't work. So use this URL. You're guaranteed to get in and find what you're looking for. So anyway, just some news. So like I said, Scott's already talked a lot about everything I was going to cover. One of the things that I was really excited about was the performance increase that occurred in the apply side of the RS secondary. And this continues on work that was done on the apply side for the HDR secondary that occurred at the very end of 12.10. And it makes the workload now to HA cluster secondaries nearly real time. And by that, I mean, we went to a customer of ours who pushes us harder than probably anyone else in the world. And they gave us an 8-minute workload of this type of overhead. And we ran it in a clustered environment. And in that 8 minutes, it took us about 66, almost 67 minutes to replicate it to an RS secondary that was running 12.10. But on 14, it was 11 minutes. So it was close to real-time application on the secondary. And like I said, this is the absolute worst case we have ever seen. So for most people, 99.9% of the, oops, just unplug my microphone here. For 99.9% of the customers, it is going to be real time for you. And with that, we're limited basically by the network latency and whatever the processing power is on the secondary. So you can expect to see, like I said, near real-time results, which means you can trust the scalability of the platform. You can feel safe in distributing your workload across the secondaries and know that they're going to be keeping up with the primary. As I said, these apply improvements are effective across the entire portfolio of the product. And by that, I mean it's affecting fast recovery or the logical recovery portion of a fast recovery following a crash. When you restore backups and you're restoring the logical logs, again, you're going to see some significant improvement with that operation as well. So that's really nice. Scott talked about the onstep -glaq command. If you do put it into repeat mode, which is every n number of seconds, I just disconnected myself again. It will show you what the transaction latency is to that node and how many transactions it is applying per second. There are some on-config parameters that will help with the new RS and HDR apply parameters. I go into great detail on these parameters in my replays. So I would encourage you to go back and look at those and get the information that's there. Asynchronous post-commit triggers is one of my most favorite features in 14. It builds on top of the loopback replication that was available in 12 and gives you the ability to replicate data via ER, not to a table, but to a stored procedure. And there's a number of use cases why this could be of value to you, such as sales reports or leaderboards or transforming data. The big one for me is the ability to replicate data to a table that doesn't have a primary key. Previously, that was not available in Informix enterprise replication. Now it is through replication to a stored procedure. As I said, it sits on top of loopback, which means that a target table must exist. However, your source and target table can be exactly the same because the data is never going to get to that target table per se. It's going to be sent to the stored procedure. All the other processes of ER remain the same. On the source side, the data gets manipulated. The Snoopy picks it up, checks all of the variables to see where is the data supposed to go, and then it gets staged in the replication queue. When it arrives on the target, though, it gets routed to the stored procedure rather than the table. And there are very specific signatures for these stored procedures that have to be followed. The stored procedure can run either against the SQL data itself or a JSON document that you send. And that will determine which of the two statement signatures you use. We also have a cascade reply parameter, which can allow any data that you change on the target to replicate back to the source. Now, with a stored procedure, you need to be very careful with this, that you don't end up in an infinite loop type of condition. So pay very close attention to this and set it with care. The other thing that's very important for asynchronous loopback replication is you need to serialize your replicate. So there is a new -- serial option that was introduced. Normally in ER, we will attempt to parallelize and multiplex updates. And as Scott mentioned, the performance of ER has been greatly enhanced because we're using the SMX protocol, which means that packets for a transaction can be received out of order. Now, if you're trying to do a change data capture environment or a leaderboard environment within your post commit trigger, then those values are going to get all screwed up. You want them applied in order, in the order in which they occurred. So you want to serialize that replicate by using the minus minus serial. So that, like I said, I love that feature. I just think it's a lot of fun. Offline conversion of secondaries. This occurred in XC4. Previous to this, if you needed to do an upgrade to your HA cluster, most likely you had to rebuild your secondaries from scratch. And that was just a pain. We're now giving you the ability to do in-place offline upgrades from 11.7 all the way through 14 XC4 and later. Now, this is a one-way operation. You can't use it to try and revert back. And if you use this, we strongly encourage you to set conversion guard just in case something bad happens and you need to revert back to your original version of the instance. There is a specific workflow that allows you to upgrade your secondaries without having to rebuild them. And you can see the major steps here. You're going to disable failover control so that a secondary instance doesn't get converted to primary when the primary goes away. You turn on conversion guard, you turn off the primary, install the new binaries, make any on-config changes you need to support the latest version of on-config, then you restart the primary. And that primary will go through its update process. Any changes that occur in either the system tables or the data tables will get written into the logical logs, and then the primary will come online. Now, the secondaries will not connect to this primary because of the version mismatch that exists between them. So your secondaries, which through this whole primary upgrade process have been able to support reads, will remain in their original state. Once the primary has been successfully upgraded, then you will turn off your secondaries one at a time, again, install the new binary, turn it on. They will go through their binary upgrade process and reconnect to the primary. The primary will send any of the logical log changes that occurred during its primary upgrade and any data that changed after that. Once that fast recovery process has completed, you then want to execute an on mode -C that forces a sync between the primary and the secondary, so that, or a checkpoint that syncs the primary and the secondary and actually enables it to be a full member of the cluster. And you'll go through doing that for each of the secondaries. If you have shared disk secondaries, obviously you turn those off first, leave them off until all of your other secondaries have been upgraded. Then you'll install the new binary, turn that one on, and it will spin right up just because it's using the same disk as the primary. So that's the changes to offline conversion of secondaries. It's going to save you a ton of time in migrating a cluster. Now, I will tell you that there are some specific upgrade steps that need to be taken when you migrate to FC6, as well as some specific upgrade steps you need to take if you upgrade to FC8. And I'll talk about each of those in just a moment. CDR Migrate Server was enhanced. It can operate in one of two modes, either static, where your instance is quiesced, so to speak. There's no transactions going on and we migrate the data, or your instance can be in what we call dynamic or online mode, allowing customers to continue to insert, update, and delete data. The problem with dynamic mode was that we could run into referential integrity problems as we tried to copy and verify the data, particularly with your primary and secondary keys. So in 14.10 FC7, well, excuse me, in 14.10 FC3 and earlier, the way we sent the data over was we would create the database schema on the target, we would not create the indexes, the primary keys, nor any constraints because the tables were in raw mode. Then we'd run these parallel load operations. And when the parallel loads were finished, then we would build all the indexes, primary keys, constraints, and so forth, and do a referential integrity check. Well, it was possible for a parallel load to load a child row before the parent row was inserted. And that would cause the RIs to fail, the whole parallel load process would fail, and the migration would fail, and we'd send you this really nice message that says, sorry, please try again later. So what we did in FC4 was create a new clause, a new phase, if you will, that says not just create schema load data, but create schema load data without referential integrity. And this will prevent these RI problems from occurring in dynamic migrations. Now, if you're in static mode, it doesn't matter because there's no data changing on the source, so you're going to get everything in the proper order. There's also a new add RI phase that gets added after the data sync for dynamic migrations. And so together, these two clauses help prevent data sync and referential integrity problems when you're doing parallel loads in dynamic mode. We also added a new add REPL check phase, which is optional. This is one that you want to use judiciously. What happens is it will add a shadow column and a composite index to your table on the source. And this table, and also on the target for that matter, it will, the composite index includes whatever the shadow column value is, as well as the columns that make up uniqueness within the table. Now, this is a slow alter process. So if you elect to use this clause, you will basically be taking each of your tables offline for the amount of time it takes to add the shadow column and build the index, and then continue on. That might or might not be acceptable to you. The intent and the reason why we added it was to speed up the sync data phase. And this is particularly helpful in dynamic migrations because it allows us to check and verify whether the row on the target precisely matches what's on the source. Reason behind that is the value that's in that shadow column can either be a type of a globally unique ID or a version number of the row if that row has been changed while the whole CDR migrate server process is in action. So we'll check the index, we'll check the row ID, and then we'll check the version number. And if the version numbers don't match, then we have to reload that row from the source. But as I said, this is a slow alter, so use it carefully. Flow control, Scott already talked about this. It was introduced earlier. In 14.10, you really don't need flow control anymore because it's just meaning the replication to the secondaries, is just insanely fast. It is just way too cool. We do have this onStat -G, either RSS or shared disk verbose output that does show you, if you ever are concerned whether flow control is affecting processing on your primary, it will show you the number of delays and when the last delay was on your primary because of flow control gating of primary processing. So like I said, this should now be extremely rare, if ever, but the onStat command will now show you information about any flow control operations. Scott already talked about ER performance. It's just wicked, wicked fast. And it's wicked, wicked fast in XC6 and higher, because all of the changes that he talked about occurred in XC6 and only take effect between nodes talking XE6 and higher nodes speaking. If you have a cluster that has XE5 and XE6, you'll use the legacy NIF protocols that he was talking about. So he already talked about the benchmark where we were using, 80 million rows, and on XE5 and earlier, it took 2 hours to load, but in XE6, it took 8 minutes. And that's a 15 times improvement. But we will tell you to expect 5 to 10%. Why? Because we want to make sure there's a margin of error. And as always, your mileage may vary. He talked about the transaction throughput rate, that CDR sync is faster, but CDR check is still about the same. As always, though, your mileage may vary on any of these statistics, so don't hold me accountable if you only get a 13 times improvement rather than the 15 times improvement that I'm showing here. He already talked about the fact that the vast majority of these changes occurred underneath the covers, that we converted from the NIF mechanism to the SMX protocol, which allows us to do parallelized transmission of data as well as out of sequence writes. For the SMX under ER, there was some specific tuning guidance given. And again, if you want an in-depth analysis of this, either go back to Scott's portion of the presentation or my FC6 replay, where I go into each of these in detail. There was a change in the send queue mechanism. In earlier versions of Informix, the ER transaction header was written into the queue header DB space, but that was deprecated in 12. So what we did in 14 is take that information and put it in the CDR DB space along with the sys CDR database itself. And all of the transaction data itself is stored in that queue data smart blob space. So whenever ER needed to send data, we'd have to do an IO from each one of those DB spaces to build the packet and send it out. In XE6 and higher, if the data is less than 26 kilobytes, we will store it in the header structure of the transaction itself. It's being written into the CDR DB space. And we will flush that data in one operation rather than two. So that dramatically increases throughput if your replicated transactions are small. And so that will reduce IO time, that will reduce network latency or network congestion and so forth. Scott already talked about the out of sequence write table or the parallel apply table. Since we're using SMX, parts of a transaction can arrive earlier or later than other parts of the transaction. And this table keeps track of what has been written. And once all the pieces are there, then we will send the commit back to the sender that yes, the transaction is complete on the target. And he already talked about the restart mechanism and everything else on here. The one thing you do need to be aware of is that with this parallel apply, if you have an out of sequence apply, if you have on insert or on update or on delete triggers that are firing on the target, some of those triggers will fire on, like I said, different components of that transaction. And since it's out of sequence, it may end up deleting, modifying, or inserting data that you don't want at that particular moment in time. You need or want the entire transaction to be applied before those triggers execute. If you call tech support, they have some magic dust that they can sprinkle on your instance to make that happen. Unfortunately, it is not an end user operation, but they would be more than willing to help you with this particular problem. Scott already talked about the ER check utility that gives you the ability to make sure your ER objects are consistent across your cluster. Are the replicates there? Are the templates there? And so forth. And if not, you'll get an error indicating what's missing. What I found in my testing is that there are some holes in this. For example, you can run this and it will say, yes, this particular replicate is available on the source and the target. However, it doesn't pick up if the target is active or inactive. So you may have a replicate that's only partially effective. Yes, it exists on the target, but you never turned it on. So this is a very good first step, but there are some additional functionality that could be added to it in the future. So here is the first of the two migration efforts that I was speaking of. You know, in version 12, we gave you the ability to do rolling upgrades, which said you could shut off an instance, you can move from one version of the instance to the next fix pack, turn it back on, and life was wonderful. You didn't have to rebuild the whole cluster from scratch. We said, however, that there were certain conditions where we would prevent you from doing this type of an in-place upgrade. And if you're moving from FC5 to FC6, this is one of those conditions. You will have to take an outage of your entire cluster to migrate to FC6. So you turn off the cluster, you load the FC6 binary on each node, and in this case, you're going to turn on the primary first, let it convert and come online, and then one by one, you'll turn on each of the secondaries, let it convert, come up and connect to the primary. And then once you're done, everything will be on FC6. What you're going to see when we go to FC8 is this process is reversed. You're going to do all your secondaries first and the primary last. So those of you who've been using Informix for a long time will remember the old installation rule. Was it 10 or was it net? You know, tools engine network or network engine tools. In this particular case, it's primary, secondary, and as I said in FC8, it's going to be secondary primary. If you're using ER and you're migrating to FC6, the process is more or less the same. You'll take, what you want to do is take each node offline, update it to the new binary and turn it back on. But you need to make sure that your queues are empty. So there is the onstat command that will help you monitor your queues. And when they've dropped down to 0 or very close to 0, you want to stop ER with a CDR stop. You'll then turn the node off, upgrade the binary, turn the node back on. Instead of executing a CDR start to restart replication, you'll execute a CDR clean start. And that will cause the syscdr to rebuild with all the new tables and columns and so forth that are needed to support the FC6 functionality, such as out-of-sequence writes and so forth. Backup from RS secondary. I think this is one thing that Scott didn't cover, so I'll spend a little bit more time on this. The ability to back up from a secondary in an HA cluster has been something that customers have been asking for years. And in FC6, we finally gave you the ability to do that from an RS secondary. Now, the functionality that was introduced in FC6 was radically changed in FC8. And so what I'm going to do is talk about what's available in FC8, but kind of give you a little bit of a flavor for what happened in FC6. But since everybody's going to be migrating to the latest version of Informix, you know, it makes sense to look at what the latest version of RS backups actually does. In order to enable backup from an RS secondary, there is this onConfig parameter that you need to turn on. Now, originally in FC6, it was not there, but in FC8, it is now part of the onConfig file. And in FC8, there are only two values that you can use, either disable it or enable it. FC6, there was another value that was possible, but like I said, it's no longer here. Under the FC6 version of this technology, you could not have any unlogged objects in your instance if you wanted to back up from the secondary. So that meant no unlogged smart blob spaces, no raw tables, no unlogged slobs, even if they were stored in a logged slob space. Hold on just a second. And so forth. And so, like I said, everything had to be logged in order to do a backup from the secondary. Scott already talked about the temp table no log parameter and what that meant or what that means for secondaries that could potentially migrate to being a primary. And we strongly recommended that you set it to 2. Oops, here we go. In FC8 though, we changed this functionality that will enable you to back up your RS secondary or back up from your RS secondary, even if you have unlogged objects in your instance. So of all those things on the previous slide I said you couldn't back up with, now you can. And it's possible by setting this archive unlogged objects parameter and restarting the instance. It is not a dynamic property or dynamic parameter. You do have to restart the instance. And there are 3 potential values for it. 0 just says, if there's anything that's unlogged, block the backup. 1 and 2 basically control how much output there is into the message file when you do your backup. 1 is what I call a concise or a quiet mode, and it will simply say, hey, I'm doing the backup, but there's unlogged objects here in your source that I'm not capturing, so be careful with it. 2 is a little bit more chatty because it will say, hey, I'm doing the backup, but oh, by the way, I'm not backing up this raw table. I'm not backing up this non-log slob space. Oh, I'm not backing up, other objects that it finds during the process. So depending on which one you want to see, you will set the parameter accordingly. So in my test instance, when I was running this, I had both a non-log slob space as well as a raw table. And in my testing on FC8, I set the archive, I turned on the restore from backup parameter, and then I set the archived unlogged objects to 0, and I tried to do a backup. And of course it failed. And in the message log, it said, here's why I failed. Here's the first object I found that violates the condition. In this case, it was my slob space, and I'm not going to allow you to back it up. When I set it to 1, the backup occurred, and I got this little concise message that says, hey, there's unlogged objects. This backup isn't a complete copy of the primary. Be aware. When I set it to 2, like I said, it told me each one of the unlogged objects it found and said, hey, this isn't a complete copy of the primary. Use it at your own risk. So those are the examples of what comes out of either of those 3 parameters. The other big change that occurred in FC8 was that Informix is now enforcing that the ltape dev parameter is the same throughout the cluster. I was looking for another word. In the past, you could have ltape dev set to whatever you needed on the primary, and all of your secondaries could be set to whatever you wanted. Dev null, dev food, it didn't matter. And there were reasons for that in earlier versions of Informix. Now, if you try and bring up a secondary and its ltape dev is different than what's on the primary, you will get an error message and the secondary will shut down gracefully and it will not allow you to come online. So just be aware of that. And I found that out the hard way because I kept bringing up secondaries and they kept failing and I couldn't figure out why until I read the message log and I said, oh, this must be new functionality. So regardless of what your archived unlogged objects parameter is, you can restore a backup that was created on the secondary. What it will do, however, is tell you that, hey, I'm restoring this backup, but it's missing raw objects. Use this backup at your own risk. There's no, I'm missing this object or I'm missing that object. It's just, this isn't a complete backup. So that's RS backup from, or that's HA backup from an RS secondary. And that's all I had on the replication side. I don't see any questions at all in the chat. So Scott did a great job in covering all this material for you. So briefly, I'm going to talk about the features that were covered in FC8. The first thing we need to talk about is migration to FC8, and specifically migration with the connection manager. With 14.10 FC7, development changed the engine such that it was possible to make sysmaster changes during a fixed pack migration. Previously, we had a rule that said you only make sysmaster changes for major additions, 14.10 to 14.50 or whatever the case might be. In FC7, we changed that to allow us to add functionality to the engine earlier that would have required sysmaster changes. So when we move to FC8, there are some systemic changes that are occurring and require rebuilding of the system databases. And in my FC8 deep dive, I go into great detail on what that process is. And in the middle of the process, I say, there are times when the secondaries are going to be blocked from doing DDL operations, or they're going to be blocked from doing DML operations and so forth. And I also explain that if you're trying to test this with developer edition in some sort of a test environment, your test will fail. And the reason being is that developer edition is limited to, I think it's 22 concurrent sessions. And during the primary upgrade process, we attempt to invoke far more than 22 concurrent sessions to upbuild sysmaster. So it causes the instance to, let's just say it causes the instance to become unreliable and you have to shut it down. So if you want to test this, download Innovator C and you can test the migration process using that. Briefly, the migration process in this particular case starts with the secondaries and moves to the primaries. And you must be on FC7W1 with the connection manager running. The reason why this is so important, and by the way, the connection manager needs to be FC50, or excuse me, 4.50 FC8. The reason why this is important is that version of the connection manager and later has the correct logic to understand what's happening within the cluster, particularly on the primary migration. So it doesn't assume that there's a primary failure and attempt to move your primary to one of your partially upgraded secondaries. And that's kind of important to understand. You may be turning the secondary back on, but it's not fully on FC8 at that moment in time. So what we recommend is that you install FC8 in a different directory than FC7, and this will be important for the IHQ migration process as well, which we'll talk about. So you will, again, I go into great detail on what this process is in my FC8 deep dive, but you'll migrate the connection manager to FC8 first, then you'll turn off each secondary, migrate it to FC8, and then you will migrate the primary. And when the primary migrates, it will go into single user mode for a while, disconnecting all users so that it can update its sysmaster tables and everything else. Now, all of those changes will be logged in the logical logs. And when the primary finishes all of its workload, it will come online and send those changes to the secondaries. They'll be applied on the secondaries, and that's when the secondaries are fully converted to FC8. And once they are applied on the secondaries will then reconnect to the primary and life will be good. So it's a very interesting process. There's a lot of nuances to it. Again, I recommend you look at the FC8 deep dive. As I mentioned, there's also a migration process for IHQ in FC8. It moved from version 1.6 to 2.0 or later. And what IHQ development strongly recommended you do is download the 2.1 version of IHQ from Fix Central and use that as opposed to the 2.0 that was released with FC8. So you can go to Fix Central, download both the server and the agent jar files, and install and use those as opposed to the ones with FC8. The underlying database to the IHQ functionality also changed, and you're going to need to migrate that database as well. Problem is that database does not support in-place migration. There is a command you have to run that actually changes all the schema structures and everything else. And there's a specific sequence for how that occurs. Again, it's easiest if the whole FC8 installation is in a different subdirectory than your FC7 environment. And in the, again, in the FC8 deep dive, I go into what that workflow is. You know, you're going to want to copy in the 2.1 server and agent jar files. You're going to want to bring over the actual database file itself along with the properties files for both the servers and the agents. You'll then run the command that migrates the database to the new version. And once that's finished, then you'll start IHQ and it will come up and work properly. Now, if, for example, you happen to do an in-place install of the Informix binary such that you install FC8 on top of FC7 and overwrite those files, there is a way that you can still migrate to the latest version of IHQ. It's covered in detail in the appendix of the FC8 deep dive. And so if you're interested in that or need that, you can go ahead and download the presentation and read those files. Some other things that occurred in FC8, Scott already talked about the Java updates. In FC9, we're now at 807.11 except for HPUX and Solaris, and there's some other information about Java that I'll be covering in just a few slides. Scott already talked about the Readahead enhancements, the fact that we made changes in FC7. There are two additional columns though in FC8, and they are the total read pages and the Readahead pages used. And ideally, these two numbers should be as close as possible. If that's the case, then you are properly using your Readahead for that particular object. Down here, I've got 131 pages in the Readahead queue, but I've only used 32 of them. So I've got a bunch of information in here that I'm not really using. So I might want to consider how I'm setting my Readahead for that particular object. We also introduced the Readahead threshold field to the auto Readahead parameter. It is a percentage parameter, and it basically says how much of the Readahead buffer remains unused before I refresh it. So if you set it to less than 50, then we will use almost, whatever that value is. Let's say it's 20%. So we'll use almost all of the Readahead buffer until there's just 20% unused, and then we'll refresh it. If you set it to 80, then what we will say is when we've used 20% of the Readahead buffer, then we'll go ahead and refresh. So we are refreshing earlier. So again, depending on whether this is important to you or you need to refresh early or late, you now have the ability, again to set that threshold. The changes in IHQ 2.1, there were some nice things, and I think Scott covered some of these. If you log in as the admin, have some new fields on the title bar. You have a button where you can shut down the IHQ server itself, or you can click on the View Agents, and it will display all of the agents that have been configured. We also give you a way um, of refining what you see. You can look at all the online or all the offline filter. That's the word I was looking for. Filter what you see and display in this View Agents field. If you click on the actual instance name, it will take you to the configuration page for that agent, which does include a Stop Agent button. Or you can click in the box in front of that particular row on the table, and it will bring a Shutdown Agent button as well. So you can turn off your agents that way. And David, I think 2.1 was released in FC9, but I haven't looked to confirm. I'm 99% sure it was. Another thing that occurred with 2.1 is we made the error and logging files a lot more user-friendly. In earlier versions, we were logging everything except for the kitchen sink, and even then the kitchen sink was thrown in sometimes just for fun. Now the stack traces are enabled at the info level, which really only gives you the information that you really truly need. So the file sizes are smaller, they're going to be easier to parse. However, you still have the flexibility to change what gets logged in the debug and trace options for both the server and the agents in their particular properties files. Some other changes that occurred in 2.1 are in the shell script utility that allows you to start and stop and make other changes to IHQ. Again, we now get the ability to filter results from a list command. So if you have 5 servers and 55 agents trying to do an IHQ list, there's a lot of stuff to parse through. If you know what your instance name is or what the property name is that you're looking for, you can do IHQ list and that name. And if that process exists, it will show it to you. The other thing is starting or stopping agents was always a multi-step process. You'd have to run a list command, write down what all the PIDs were, and then go back and execute an individual operation for each one of those PIDs. Now it's interactive. You can say stop server, and the utility will come back and say, I see all of these servers. Do you want to turn them all off, or do you want to step through them one at a time? And the same thing for agents. I can see all of these agents. Do you want to stop them all or go through them interactively and say, keep on, turn off, keep on, turn off, etc. It's nicer. There's also some changes in the graphical interface. So stored procedures and functions are now output in tabular form rather than in linear form. So it looks a lot like a DB schema output. In the logical logs section, we're now showing you which is the current log, what the log usage is, and if you hover over it, will actually give you a numeric value of how much has been used, whether the logical log is backed up, and so forth. And finally, there's now a button that allows you to copy the chunk path in that particular window, and that's IHQ. So now some enhancements. And again, these were all covered in the FC8 deep dive. HPUX. We will be stopping or deprecating support for HPUX soon. Now, I didn't give you an exact date because we haven't come up with one, but it's reasonable to assume that it will be sometime next year. And it's not because we hate HPUX, we love it. It's just that HP is saying that they're doing away with HPUX. So in the forthcoming fix packs, don't be surprised if all of a sudden HPUX support disappears. What I can tell you for sure is that when we come out with v.next in the middle of next year, HPUX will not be a supported platform. So if you're on HPUX and you need to migrate and you have questions or concerns, feel free to reach out to us at IBM, or there's a number of partners who would be glad to step in and help you with your migration process. The other big announcement is we're going to be removing the Java runtime engine that's part of Informix. Now, when we came out with 14.10, we said that your system, the operating system, had to have Java 8 in order for us to install the product, and that is still true. But once the product was installed, if you had Java user-defined routines or other operations that use Java, we used the JRE that was bundled within the engine. In the very near future, that JRE will be removed. And if you're wondering where it lives, it's underneath the Krakatoa directory. And for those of you who are like me, what little hair you have left is white. You will understand the joke of this particular directory structure. For those of you who are younger and don't get what I'm talking about, there is a movie called Krakatoa East of Java, and it was very popular back in, I think it was released in 1968. So there was this internal debate or this internal developer joke that they would stick Java inside the Krakatoa directory. Anyway, in the future, that directory will be going away, and you will need to set a new Java home environment that will point to a system JRE that you will control. So this will give you the ability to migrate Java versions as you need for your particular environment. We've also removed some communication support modules because, as Scott said, we've moved to TLS. We only support TLS 1.2 or 1.3, as he talked about. And that's everything I have. Are there any questions?